I'm Shaima Khalil on Witness History, bringing you first-hand accounts from the past as told by the women who were there. These important moments in history help us to understand the world we live in today. Join me for Witness History on BBC World News.
This is BBC World News. I'm Nuala McGovern. Our top stories. A state visit by King Charles to France is postponed because of more planned protests against President Emmanuel Macron's pension reforms.
We'd be lacking some sense to propose to His Majesty the King and the Queen Consort to come and make a state visit in the middle of the demonstrations.
The price of dissent in Russia, how a child's drawing sparked a police investigation, a criminal case and a family torn apart. On day 4 of the trial of Gwyneth Paltrow over her role in a ski crash accident, the actress herself is preparing to give testimony. We'll have the latest. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. The state visit of King Charles to France has been postponed, and it would have been the monarch's first such trip overseas since becoming king. The French and British governments took the decision following a phone call between President Emmanuel Macron and the king, and it follows the widespread protests over France's pension reforms. The Interior Ministry says more than 450 protesters were arrested and 440 members of the security forces injured on Thursday, when more than 1 million people took to the streets to protest against the retirement age being raised from 62 to 64. From Paris, here's our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
Tear gas, riot police. This is Paris at the moment. There are piles of uncollected rubbish in the streets and angry demonstrators on the streets, furious with President Macron over his plans to raise the state pension age to 64. Matters appear to be deteriorating, and next week's state visit by King Charles and the Queen Consort was clearly in the protesters' sights. So, from President Macron, a change of plan.
Je pense que nous ne serions pas sérieux.
It wouldn't have been serious of us, and we'd have lacked common sense if we'd proposed a state visit to His Majesty the King and the Queen Consort in the midst of the protests, the President told journalists. The two men met several times when Charles was Prince of Wales. After today's decision was taken, the President telephoned the King to explain that the first state visit of his reign would have to be postponed. So what should have been the glittering confirmation of a restored relationship with a ceremonial welcome here at the Arc de Triomphe will have to wait. Paris, quite simply, is in no fit state to welcome the King and the Queen Consort. The entente cordiale between the two governments may be back on track after the post-Brexit tensions, but on the streets of France, there is anger. And that's the problem. This was the town hall in Bordeaux last night, a building the King and the Queen Consort had been due to visit next Tuesday. And this was the National Assembly a few days ago, as France's Prime Minister did her best to explain why members weren't being given a vote on the pension reforms. The King had been due to address the French Senate. And this very grand building is the Palace of Versailles, where the state banquet had been planned for Monday evening. Hardly the right backdrop in present circumstances. The state visit to France will be rearranged. The visit to Germany will go ahead as planned. But Paris hasn't been completely denied the sight of King Charles. The local waxworks unveiled its version of a kilted king today. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, Paris.
Rather good likeness, I think. Let's get more on this story with our correspondent, Charlotte Gallagher. Good to have you with us, Charlotte. So was this expected? I know there has obviously been so many protests in France of late.
No, it was a real 11th hour cancellation. As of this morning, we thought the trip was going ahead. We expected there might be some alterations to the itinerary given the protests and the scenes we've seen across France, but we had no idea that the trip would be cancelled. But I think it was becoming obvious that widespread civil disobedience and a royal visit really don't mix. So you've got police and security services, they're already stretched with protests. More than 1 million people took to the streets yesterday. And then they would have also had to protect the royal couple. And you can imagine the King's own security team might have been quite concerned because these protests, of course, they're not about the King. But if his visit was targeted in some way by protests, it would have got maximum publicity, wouldn't it?
And I suppose the Bordeaux town hall, some of those images were quite shocking as we saw it go up in flames. And I think the couple were expected to drop by.
They were meant to go to the town hall in Bordeaux. The town hall's front door was set on fire. They were meant to be going there to talk about organic vineyards. But of course, no one would be talking about the vineyards, would they? They'd be talking about the protests and the fires that are being set. 900 fires were set on the streets of Bordeaux yesterday. And I think it just would have been impossible to have that kind of visit and that kind of civil disobedience. It just wouldn't have worked at all. And the photos could have looked really bad, couldn't they? If you had the King and Camilla riding down the Champs-Élysées, which they were supposed to, and then there were violent protests nearby, it just wouldn't have looked great, would it? I think this is really embarrassing for President Macron. Obviously, this has had to be cancelled. But I'm sure the King is really disappointed as well that his first state visit has had to be postponed in this way. Germany's going ahead, obviously. That's still happening. But France is one of the oldest and the closest allies of the UK. And I'm sure himself and Camilla were really looking forward to this trip.
Was there much said from Buckingham Palace?
Not really. They released a very upbeat statement, in fact, saying the royal couple were greatly looking forward to going to France at some point in the future. And President Macron has suggested that could take place in the summer. But people close to the King, we heard them on the radio earlier on the BBC saying that they thought he would be personally disappointed that this had happened. And they were also saying that President Macron had such affection for the Queen. We saw he came to the funeral and he talked very fondly about the Queen. He, no doubt, will be really disappointed that this has had to be cancelled in such a way. But really, you just couldn't have had any monarch, really, of any country on the streets of France at the moment with these kind of protests.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. And with the protests, you did mention that they've set the Bordeaux town hall door on fire, but there was no correlation on them doing that with the anticipated visit?
No, it's absolutely nothing to do with the King and the Queen Consort's visit. It's all to do with anger about President Macron and his proposals to raise the pension age in France. The protests were nothing to do with the King, but it was the thought perhaps his visit could be targeted as part of those protests in a way to embarrass President Macron, because obviously this was a big deal for him having this state visit. But the protests themselves are nothing to do with the UK or the British royal family.
Charlotte, thanks so much for coming in to speak to us about the latest on that story. Let's turn to Russia now. Russians who protest against the war in Ukraine take considerable risks by doing so. They can lose their jobs, even their freedom. But in one town, a Russian man currently is being prosecuted for anti-war posts on social media, and it risks him losing his daughter. The child, who's now 13, has been sent to a children's home, and social services are taking legal action to restrict the father's parental rights. Pressure on the family began last year. That was after the girl drew an anti-war picture at school. From the town of Yefremov, Steve Rosenberg reports.
This is the last time Masha Moskalyova was seen in public. Police had just detained her father for anti-war social media posts. Masha was taken to a children's home. It was on March the 1st. But the story began last year with a picture. 12-year-old Masha drew it at school. Glory to Ukraine, it says. No to war, as Russian missiles fly in. Then the problems started. Town councillor Olga Podolskaya says Masha's father, a single parent, contacted her to say the school, shocked by the drawing, had called the police.
Her father, Alexei, told me he was dumbfounded. Then the police began checking his social media. They told him he was bringing up his daughter in a bad way. The authorities want everyone to toe the line. No one is allowed to have their own opinion.
Alexei is under house arrest and not allowed to talk to us. Since Masha drew that picture, he's been charged twice with discrediting the Russian army. He could now be sent to prison. His lawyer says Alexei is distraught without his child.
Alexei is very worried about his daughter. He doesn't know what's happening to her. The social services seem obsessed with this family. I think that's purely for political reasons. The family's problems only began after the girl drew that picture.
We tried contacting Masha's school to get its side of the story. School number 9 didn't respond to a written request for comment. So we went along there, but were told, no, we couldn't come in. We tried calling, same result. Across town, supporters of the family gathered in court. Return Masha to her father, it says. The local Juvenile Affairs Commission is taking legal action to restrict Alexei's parental rights. The Commission has yet to respond to our request for comment. Alexei Moskalyov had wanted to come here to court, but he wasn't allowed to interrupt his house arrest to be here, even though what's at stake is whether his rights as a father are going to be restricted and whether his child will be taken away from him. Local activists are doing what they can to help, buying food and supplies for father and daughter. But when we ask the Moskalyovs' neighbours what they think, they're reluctant to say. I'm scared to, Angelina says. I'm frightened to answer. Sorry, she says, I won't express an opinion. And that too paints a picture of today's Russia, of the level of fear. Dissent is unacceptable, punishable. What those in power here expect is people's support, no matter what decisions are taken. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Yefremov, Russia.
Thanks to Steve. Let's turn to Israel. Its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held talks with UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in Downing Street on Friday. But the visit comes at a time of political turmoil in Israel. The country has been gripped by months of some of the biggest demonstrations in its history over the government's plans to limit the power of the courts. Protesters gathered outside Downing Street as well. There was a planned photo opportunity for the gathered media that was cancelled, and there was no joint statement. During their meeting, Mr. Sunak and Mr. Netanyahu were expected to discuss strengthening strategic ties, the war in Ukraine, and forging a united international front against Iran's nuclear programme. That is according to Mr. Netanyahu's office. Paul Adams reports.
Mr. Netanyahu, your own Attorney General says you're breaking the law.
Israel's Prime Minister arriving in Downing Street this morning. A warm welcome from Rishi Sunak, but the sounds of anguished protest ringing out behind them. It's nothing Mr. Netanyahu hasn't seen for weeks back home, on a much, much bigger scale. But his domestic woes are now following him wherever he goes.
For the first time in a really long time, British Jews are really making a stand, taking a stand, making clear statements in support of the Israeli protesters. They don't want anything to do with what we're seeing in Israel, the racism, the extremism, the deterioration from democracy and liberal values.
A battle for the soul of Israel has been raging for weeks. Mr. Netanyahu's opponents are furious at legal reforms, which they say will undermine the rule of law and shield the Prime Minister from his own legal difficulties.
We have a dictator in Israel that is trying to make these people hurt us. You tell your government, you tell your people.
Protesters outside the British embassy in Tel Aviv last week. They want Israel's traditional allies to intervene. But this week, Britain and Israel said their bilateral relationship had never been closer. For Palestinians, Israel's political turmoil forms a noisy backdrop to their own difficult lives. This morning, they queued up at Israeli checkpoints, hoping to reach Jerusalem for the first Friday prayers of Ramadan. There's real tension here. Violence is on the rise in the West Bank. The coming weeks could be challenging. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Stay with us on BBC World News, still to come. On day 4 of the trial of Gwyneth Paltrow over her role in a skiing accident, the actor and businesswoman prepares to give testimony.
I'm now back in my school in Irpin. Now there is a good shelter here, and we can finish our drawings. It's good that it was restored.
Now is the time for a new impulse. Moving from a stable ground to a tipping point. Now is the time to be ahead. Now is the time for agility, for sustainable acts. Now is your time.
Go to a place which creates memories. Create your memories. Experience Serbia. National Tourism Organization of Serbia.
This is BBC World News, the latest headlines. Actually, let us move on to Deutsche Bank. European leaders have offered reassurance about the stability of the banking system after big falls in the share price of major lenders. The head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, said Eurozone banks were resilient because they had strong capital and liquidity positions. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, and the French President, Emmanuel Macron, also said European banks were solid. The fall in bank stocks was led by Germany's biggest lender, Deutsche Bank, with its share price at 1 point down more than 14%, although it did then recover in later trading. Germany's Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, was in Brussels to meet other European Union leaders for talks about the economy. He was asked if Deutsche Bank was still a trustworthy organisation.
Die Deutsche Bank hat ihr Geschäftsmodell grundlegend.
Deutsche Bank has fundamentally modernised and reorganised its business model and is a very profitable bank. There is no need to worry about anything.
For more on this, I'm joined by our business reporter, Samira Hussain. Samira, good to have you with us. We see Mr. Scholz there trying to reassure people. What else has been said?
Well, if you look at what's happened over the last couple of weeks, you've seen that that central banks have come in to help European banks that were at risk. And of course, that's Credit Suisse. The hope, of course, was that was going to calm the nerves of investors. Something similar has happened here in the United States, where regulators swooped in to help the Silicon Valley Bank and the Signature Bank and protected all of the deposits. But investors are still nervous, and that's really what you're seeing a lot of here. That you may have had some of these actions taken, but investors are still jittery, now wondering, oh, is Deutsche Bank the next bank that could potentially fail?
Because with this, Samira, what I'm wondering, and I imagine a lot of our viewers are also wondering, when they see these desperate stories, is it indicative of some larger trend?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, really what this all comes down to, or one of the big things that this comes down to, is interest rates. So we've seen central banks in Europe and in the United States raise rates. Now, one of the unintended consequences of these rate rises is the impact that it's having on banks. So some of the financial instruments that banks hold as collateral, as interest rates go up, those lose their value. And so that's why people are talking about this liquidity issue. And that's what's making a lot of people nervous. And so now we saw that this week, central banks, both in the United States and in Europe, still raised interest rates, but they did so at a smaller portion. But what's really lending to a lot of confusion is some things that have been said here in America about whether or not that if some other bank were to find itself in the midst of a crisis, would the central bank do much to step in to help them out? And that was sort of left somewhat unclear.
Because I suppose people might be wondering, how could central bank or indeed governments try and restore investor confidence after these, I don't know whether to call them something major or something like a hiccup?
It's a bit woolly, this whole investor confidence thing. It's hard to really sort of pinpoint. And from regulators' point of views, well, they kind of thought they did that. They've been saying all the right things. They came in and took decisive action very early on and are also making comments that this is not a repeat of any of the past financial crises. It's really hard to say what would restore that kind of investor confidence, but that's really what this is all about right now.
Okay, so just with Deutsche Bank at the moment, how is it doing after Olaf Scholz spoke out?
Right. So, and as you rightly pointed out, you saw that was able to recover some of its share price in Europe. It's still feeling a little bit of pressure here in the United States, as all bank stocks are. But, I think in the end, this is going to take a little while to sort of completely shake out because of the way that interest rates are going.
Samira, thanks so much for bringing us up to date with the latest financial story that we are watching. Let me turn to Hollywood next, though, because the actor Gwyneth Paltrow is due to take the stand on Friday in a court case involving a skiing accident. She's been sued by a retired optometrist who claims she caused a collision in 2016. Terry Sanderson, who is now 76, alleges he was hit from behind. Ms. Paltrow says it was Mr. Sanderson's own fault. Ms. Paltrow has been sued for $300,000. Let me turn to Sophie Long, our West Coast correspondent, who's following this story for us. Good to have you with us, Sophie. I mean, there's been an awful lot of media interest in this particular story, but what are you hearing where you are on how this might shake down?
Yeah, there has been a huge amount of media interest, and that's only increased today because we hear that Gwyneth Paltrow herself may indeed take to the stand. Now, I should caveat that with the fact that things have moved over the past few days. This is day 4 of the trial, and it really is a he said, she said situation. As you set out there, Gwyneth Paltrow is accused of crashing into Mr. Sanderson on the ski slope of Park City, a very upmarket ski resort in Utah, in February of 2016. So this case has been going on for some time. Now, he says that she crashed into him, and not only that, but then carried on down the mountain without checking that he was okay. She denies those accusations and says that actually it was him who was the cause of the collision. So over the past few days, it's been a very expert witness heavy trial as the plaintiff tries to set out the impact that this has had on him. He says that he sustained a permanent brain injury and also broke 4 ribs at the time, whereas Gwyneth Paltrow's lawyers are trying to paint a picture of a man who's now 76 with a decline in mental health that perhaps could be normal for a man of his age with his medical history. So we expect today to potentially hear from both Mr. Sanderson, the 76-year-old plaintiff, and Gwyneth Paltrow herself as well. But that could go into next week. The trial's slated to last until next Thursday.
I'm just curious because sometimes when there is an American story, particularly where Hollywood is involved, there's an awful lot of media speculation around it. Is that what you're seeing in the United States as well?
Yeah, I mean, this court feed, unlike other states, in California, for example, there are no cameras allowed inside court. This has all been filmed from the beginning. So there were complaints from Gwyneth Paltrow's legal team on the first day that the camera was trained constantly on her while she looked distracted looking at her phone. And also they complained that reporters outside court in Utah and Park City had come way too close to her. This is all being fed on a live stream, and you can see if you watch it that the comments, there's a huge amount of interest in it, and the public commenting on everything that goes on. The court has broken just at the moment for a short break. We've been hearing from one of Mr. Sanderson's daughters today, who became very emotional when she talked about what a wonderful zest for life he had before the accident, and she was really reiterating what her elder sister had said about her father the day before. Yesterday we heard from her, who was talking about what a wonderful grandfather he'd been to her 2 children and how he'd changed since. So we're starting to see much more personal and more emotional testimony, and we might indeed hear from both the main characters in the story a little later today.
Right, which no doubt there'll be so much interest in as well. You mentioned it's day 4. Do we have any idea how long this trial may last?
Yeah, it's scheduled to last until Thursday next week. So if we don't hear from Gwyneth Paltrow today, then we're likely to hear from her at the beginning of next week. I mean, the damages being sought in this case are quite interesting. You mentioned in your introduction there that Mr. Sanderson is suing Gwyneth Paltrow for $300,000. She is countersuing for a symbolic $1. Both those amounts really must pale into insignificance when you think in the United States of the medical bills and the legal fees that both sides will have been subjected to at this stage. This has been going on since 2016. So it's scheduled to go far into next week. We expect the jury to go out by Thursday.
Sophie, thank you so much for joining us, bringing us up to date on that particular case that there is so much interest in. No doubt we'll check back in with you again. Now, police in Montenegro have formally charged the cryptocurrency entrepreneur Do Kwon with several offences after confirming his identity. He was detained at Podgorica airport on Thursday while trying to board a flight to Dubai. It is alleged he was carrying forged passports. Mr. Do, who's a South Korean national, is wanted by several countries, including the United States. That's after the collapse of his Singapore-based crypto exchange. It's claimed investors lost up to $40 billion. He had developed two cryptocurrencies, Terra USD and also Luna. They both collapsed last May and they're now effectively worthless. We are at the moment waiting to see US President Joe Biden, he's in Ottawa, as you can see, but he'll be meeting with Justin Trudeau. You can see the Canadian flag there. We are expecting that to happen in probably the next few minutes or so. So if you do stay with World News, we'll be able to bring you up some of those pictures, of course. And what they say, of course, a very important relationship between Canada and the United States. But we are expecting them to address the audience that you see there. And we will bring you whatever is said in the highlights and go to it live if you're watching then on BBC News. Do stay with us if you can.
Hello there.